I spent the earlier part of this year in Mogadishu, Hargeisa, and Garowe on behalf of the development partners trying to ponder the question of infrastructure policy. So I come from outside, but with a few modest observations to make and hence questions to ask. Now, I'll start with Edward and then Michael. You talked about history and policy, but it was in passing. You hinted at something extremely important, but very quickly. Now, I'll argue that if you're thinking about policy in Africa today, that is probably the most important subject. Policy appreciating history. Now, my question to you is, Edward, how does that instruct your interaction with the continent, your day-to-day work? Now, then to Michael, thank you very much for your presentation. Getting down to Somaliland, Puntland, and Somalia, we have discrete institutional sets. I'm going to use the word institution as opposed to culture. Institution, I'm talking about norms, values, and practices that shape society. So we've got discrete institutional sets in in the place. Now, when you are trying to craft policy, here's the challenge then. You have got a layer on top of that, which is called politics, that tries to cover the discrete underlying forces. Then you have policy on top of it. So when you have someone out there trying to craft policy, each time you dig deep, again now into history, each time you dig deep and try to examine the underlying institutional sets, and that takes you into history, the whole process becomes very messy. And of course, most development work, whether we like it or not, is very transactional. So you're trying to find a way of getting something done. So now, there lies the challenge. How do you think, and I'm going to be fair to you, I don't expect you to have a straight answer on this. How do you think we should proceed? Do we proceed by saying that let's set out an evolutionary policy process, so you don't go and say, okay, this is what we must do to progress infrastructure, but you say, here's a platform, so let the people somehow craft their own policy? Or do you attempt to use the traditional method which says, all right, do A, B, C, D as policy prescriptions? Thank you very much.
Yes, I mean, history absolutely informs the work we're doing here, although we're essentially dealing with contemporary issues and trying to disseminate the knowledge of experts and to promote best practice and good ideas. I don't think you can begin looking at any topic without a knowledge of history. I mean, sometimes it'll go a long way back, but even thinking of when I went to do the research on nursing and midwifery in Somaliland, you know, the first thing I asked Fawzia Ismail to Mohammed to tell me about was, you know, day one, what was it like for these 6 ladies, half a dozen ladies, who came back to resuscitate those sectors in the country? What did the whole scene look like? And so from there you get the knowledge that, well, on day one, we didn't even know how many registered nurses we have. Now, this is only 15 years ago now in that case, so it's almost not history. But I think that same approach in going back to basics, as it were, and as far as is necessary, in this case there wasn't much need to go back any further, is absolutely critical. We here have been reminding people to think about the Great War in Africa and the impact in Eastern Africa in particular in this centenary year of the outbreak. Now, I can't say to you with any certainty as a historian of that period that that's what gave rise to nationalism. These are kind of binary statements. But what you should be aware of, I think, in doing anything on the continent is you know, the immense effects that an upheaval like that had on societies. You know, you've got an area of 750,000 square miles in Eastern Africa that was direly affected by the fighting in the First World War. You know, we've got casualties in African societies, principally among civilians, well over 100,000. You know, that's more than 50% higher than India's war dead in the First World War. Well, we know a lot more in popular imagination here about India's sacrifice in the war than we do about East Africa's. So, yeah, I'm not saying that you know, history is going to solve any lessons, but I think that it's an absolutely relevant tool. And I would say, undoubtedly, that perhaps in your field and you know, among development practitioners and among diplomats, there is too little recognition of history. People are engaging in societies about which they know nothing. And for me, that's terribly dangerous, because you know, nobody's perfect, but I mean, we try to immediately engage on any project with the people who know. So, you know, if we're writing, if there's a publication about finger millet in Gutu in Zimbabwe, it's not what we know about it. We want to hear what the expert who was born there, etc., knows about it. They might not be 100% right, but that's where your interrogation must start. Sorry, that's a lot longer than I meant to, but I'm quite passionate on this subject, and we can continue. Michael, on the issue of policy.
In a funny way, my answer is the same as Edward's. To comment directly on the way you asked the question, Fred, in most cases, I do think we need to be a lot more prepared to take an evolutionary approach. The one exception is infrastructure. The reason I think that we need to take a more evolutionary approach is precisely because one of the faults of development, from my perspective, as an industry, and it is an industry, almost unquestionably, is that we as development professionals technicalize the process of development. And you cannot technicalize it, because what you do by doing that is you become an expert in something, and then you think you can go and do that something everywhere. Afghanistan, Iraq, no problem. Now I'm going to do Somalia. Now I'm going to do... And it doesn't work, because, exactly as Edward said, you don't have that understanding of the place you're working. And the culture of the place you're working makes so much difference in terms of actually doing the most simple things, in terms of, you know, achieving a development objective of one sort or another. So it just seems to me that as an industry, we've got things the wrong way around. We've started with the idea of the technical knowledge being the thing that needs to lead the process, and we then assume that all the sort of cultural stuff's going to follow along after that. In the Somali context, I have an abiding memory of sitting in a meeting and listening to a very senior diplomat, not Somali, who was responsible for representing a major international body in Somalia, saying, "I have never understood clan, I have no interest in clan, and I don't want to know anything about it." Now, to me that makes no sense whatsoever. I know it might be quite complicated trying to understand Somali clans, but actually you have to. You can't not understand it. And you can't do what another person that I regret hearing say was walk into a really important meeting of quite high profile people and say, "So, tell me what your clan is." I mean, you have to know. You can't ask. And you certainly can't ask in a meeting. You just have to know. That's the point. You have to know. And if you don't have that commitment to understanding the place, then your technical knowledge is not likely to help you that much. Now, I said the one exception in that is often infrastructure, where I think that there is a need for a great deal of technical expertise, and there is the potential, as long as you have the cultural context covered by someone else, to go in and be an expert in something which you could do in a different place on a different day, but undertaking much the same process. So if we're talking about building roads or building reservoirs or building bridges or whatever it is, then yes, there is a whole lot of reason why you need really deep technical expertise, and that should lead to the process once you get to the implementation stage. But for most other things, and for politics more than anything else, I think you have to take an evolutionary approach. I don't know whether it's acceptable again to mention the word building blocks, a process that was abandoned in the 90s, an incremental process of trying to build from the ground up a series of peace settlements will support this process within Somalia. It was abandoned because it was too slow, it wasn't showing good enough results, it wasn't predictable enough what the outcomes were going to be. Well, I'm afraid that you've just got to deal with those things. We've got to deal with those things. We have to be able to deal better with unpredictability and so on. And that's a tough challenge for the development community, because our accountability goes backwards to donors, not downwards, whatever we might say, to the people that we're working with. And that accountability chain is a problem. And there's not an easy way of changing that. But we have to recognize that it is a real problem. I think there is a recognition of that. I mean, it's there. I'm not saying that people are blind to it. They're not. But I think that evolutionary thing is often actually what does need to happen.
You spoke about Somaliland needing a sponsor from the international community, and there seems to be a lack of it. Why do you think that to be the case? And what could Somaliland do to attract an international sponsor for their recognition? That's my first question. The second one is, you spoke about development of Somaliland, and for Somaliland to develop, of course, they would need investment. And one of the challenges that Somaliland or the business community in Somaliland face is to find a guarantor for international investment. Do you see, or do you look into the challenges and how they can overcome on those? Thank you.
Somaliland is in a very difficult position strategically. We have one side of Horn of Africa who really are not interested at all to accept the Somaliland recognition. And on the other hand, we have southern Somalia, of course. And of course, many other influence who do not want to sort of give the recognition to Somaliland. And the West has given up, in my opinion, that unless the neighboring country accepts Somaliland, the West is not interested to listen. And my question is, because of where Somaliland is, and because of the neighboring, they see Somaliland as a threat. Therefore, the West has to answer that position where Somaliland is, that they should recognize Somaliland, because I don't see in the foreseeable future Somaliland will be recognized by the neighboring country. Thank you.
There's a lot about those two questions that relates to each other, so maybe I can answer both at once. My comments before about recognition were that Somaliland doesn't have a sponsor. How do you find a sponsor? Well, the only way of finding a sponsor is to find some way of telling someone, convincing someone, that it is in their interests to recognize Somaliland. And it's actually very hard to see how that would happen at the moment. Now, Iqbal made the point that there were a number of openings that have been missed. That's true as well. There have been a number of opportunities. You mentioned Rwanda and South Africa. I know in the case of Rwanda, I remember when they were expressing a willingness to table a motion at an African Union meeting, which was then the opportunity passed. South Africa sent a fact-finding mission. There was a report. The report got kind of lost. It was never widely circulated. Now, in both of those circumstances, it wasn't primarily Somaliland's fault, but Somaliland could have done more to raise those issues. So there's a degree of proactivity needed there. But I think the issue of a sponsor still remains, that unless it's in someone's interests to do that, the best that Somaliland is going to be able to do is this incremental process. But the incremental process is happening better now than it was before. There has been an increased sophistication in terms of the message that's going out there, and a willingness to engage on, for example, the investment conference recently held in London, sponsored by, with the support of the British government. That was quite a significant thing. There have been significant steps like that on a number of occasions. So I think building on that stuff, I don't think it's going to lead to a sudden moment when Britain is suddenly going to say, oh yeah, okay, Somaliland, we recognize Somaliland. I don't think that's going to happen in the foreseeable future, but there is a process that is happening, which is just as important, maybe in some ways even more so. In terms of guarantors for international investment, that also is, I mean, there are advances there as well. I just mentioned that conference recently in London. There are a lot of people focused on that. It has been actually quite encouraging after a bad start to see the degree to which DFID has engaged on the remittance issue. There has been a real willingness to try to look for ways to create a sustainable institutional arrangement that would enable remittances to be placed on a much firmer footing going into the future. Now, that corridor thing, I'm still not quite sure all the technical details about how that's supposed to work, but it's been encouraging to see that happen. And in the same way, there is an awareness that there's a need to find ways of supporting Somaliland and the whole of the Somali Horn of Africa, in fact, to establish business investment relationships which are secure. Now, the Somali political divisions at the moment do nothing to help that situation. The process of offering, agreeing, competing interests for oil exploration between Puntland, Somaliland and Mogadishu, each of them issuing for the same areas a license to go and prospect, that isn't helping. It would be, in a magic world of, it doesn't exist, this world, but in this ideal world, it would actually be in everyone's long-term interest to set aside their differences and say, okay, we're going to agree that each of the administrative units can make binding agreements, and we will honour those binding agreements in the future, whatever comes, whatever happens, whatever political settlement there is. That would be in everyone's interest, because you would see the whole area start to develop a lot faster, but I can't see that happening. So I don't know about the guarantor for investment, except that I know that there are advances being made. On the recognition, well, I can kind of see it's easier to imagine a sort of landscape, a future horizon, at least a little way in the future. But I'm afraid that horizon does not, the way I can see it, it doesn't have full sovereign recognition on it.
Well, firstly, I have to say Somaliland has come a long way on this issue. When I first entered this file, if you like, in the year 2000, the first time I met the late President Igal, and how the issue has now entered the sort of front lines, if you like, of publications, of policymakers, and so forth. And it was that type of lobbying, both at the party level of the ANC and then which became government policy, led to the South African international law advisors to issue an international law advice. And that advisory note basically said that Somaliland qualifies for international recognition. That document was shared with the African Union Commission, and the head of legal affairs then at the African Union Commission advanced it. And then it made a lot of progress to the point that it was tabled even at the African Union's Peace and Security Council. But like all files, if the prime proponent does not run with it with the type of rigor required, it's very difficult for others to run with it. Others can help, they can assist, they can facilitate, yeah? And that's what the countries promised to did. So I think it's come a long way now with the angle of investment and business, and also with the fact that the UK government is more interested in the file than previously. You can see that incremental increase when you meet the parliamentarians here and so forth. That would be another angle where they would engage when they have discussions with fellow African states on the matter itself. I know the UK has even raised it with neighboring countries as well. But it comes back to this issue of the champion and then the country itself, here the Somaliland administration government, to run with the file. Even Ghana, at the last, not the last, few years back when they hosted the African Union Summit, showed a lot of promise in this regard and were willing to put it onto the agenda. So there is the goodwill. It's a question when the opening arrives and some progress is made to stay the course and to press on. The ANC had to do it for many, many years till it got to the end. So never to let go of that challenge and to keep the course with all the energy it requires. It's almost like a long-distance marathon, but you do reach the end. So to sum up, the African Union Commission, including the current chairperson, is aware of the file, Dr. Nkosazana Soma. The commissioners are aware of the file. The question is how to advance it to the next stages and to find the key champions who back the case fully. Like all issues in international relations, I've come to the conclusion international relations is not very rational. You just have to press at the door and knock away all the time. And until someone really then opens the door and brings about the opening, then you see your file advancing. What is also clear to me is that there are many other cases in the Horn of Africa where they stayed the course, pressed on. The case of South Sudan, the case of Eritrea. Eritrea did it alone for 30 years. They decided they're going to the battlefield. Of course, the Eritreans in the diaspora helped a lot, but essentially it was the longest continuous liberation battle in Africa for independence. Incidentally, the OAU was not sympathetic at that point. And I recall when President Isaias attended the first OAU meeting, he berated them and really gave them a talking down of the role they had played in opposing self-determination. So I think those are the contours of how we could possibly advance this far.
Based in Mali, Uganda, where I was born. I'm Indian, I'm African, I'm also a European. So I'm not inside, outside. I'm in the, as Chinese say, in the Middle Kingdom. Let me continue from my sister's point of view. I think put the nail in the coffin. There's an elephant missing here, a big elephant called President Museveni. 2016 is the next time of elections in Uganda, my country. And that's a big date for Somaliland, for Sudan, for Congo, for Rwanda, and others. Because the history of President Museveni for 30 years is a history of regional conflict. The United Nations has already recorded that President Museveni owes Congo $12 billion US. I didn't say it, it's not a nation's report. Someday, sometime, Ugandans have to pay back that money for the loot in the Congo wars. Now, having said that, my question to the panel is very simple. This business of knowledge, experts, policymakers, development. I was a student of the late Professor Damodere of Uganda. He just said, no, development is dead. It died a long time back in the 60s. My question is as follows. Inside outsiders, colonizer and the colonized. The British Empire never died. It's live and kicking in other forms. My question to the panel is simple. This business of recognition of nation states, who decides about notions of states, nation states, legitimacy, recognition? An open question is as follows. It seems to me the narrative is one of Pan-Africanism, either the Du Bois model, going to Nkrumah, going back to Nyerere and so on, or the Garvey model. So there's a conflict between the Garveyist conception of Pan-Africanism and a Du Bois conception of Pan-Africanism. My question is this: how do we outsiders become insiders? Because once you are part of British island, this country, and you live here, you are insider already. You're not outsider. So what we're trying to do in Uganda right now is to say Uganda is a British creature. It's your baby. You want it, you have it. Because DFID has so far not answered the issue of President Museveni. And my question to the panel is very simple. Uganda is the one country which it goes haywire in 2016, 2017. We all remember Idi Amin. And that's all there is to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
If Museveni is the elephant in the room, who is the lion? I don't know. I don't know how to unpack that. In many ways, colonialism is not particularly dead, but it takes very different forms. So if it's not dead, then it's now a commercial version of itself. But I'm not sure how that helps us with Somaliland.
I wanted to know how important you think centralized planning is to a successful Somaliland, and by successful, I don't necessarily mean international recognition. So like in the 70s after the coup, we saw a move towards socialism. So I thought, how important do you think that centralized planning, economically and politically, how important it is to Somaliland?
I'm going to admit to my Guardian reading liberal tendencies when I say that my natural instinct is to say it's very important in a lot of ways. But in the Somali context, I find it very difficult to see how a strong central planning government is going to work, because I don't think history suggests that's going to function very well. It hasn't in the past. So my suspicion is that actually Somali nation states in the Somali Horn, whatever shape they take, I suspect are likely to be darlings of the economist and the neoliberals forever, because what will probably work best is highly deregulated markets which are oriented towards trade, where the government is relatively weak, and where clan still plays quite a significant role in social structure and as a backstop for crisis and so on for people. So my suspicion is that the Somali context works against my natural tendency to sort of go with that more liberal interpretation of the role of central government and planning. So it's kind of an interesting position for me to be in, intellectually. But there you go. That's my answer. So I suspect there's not going to be a government, a Somali government, that is particularly successful and has great legitimacy and durability, that also takes on a very substantial role for themselves in planning, broadly speaking. There is need for more planning, though. There's need for planning. I mean, again, we get back to infrastructure. That's one of the areas where there's a very clear lack. The vibrancy of the telecommunications sectors and the money transfer and so on is all very well, and it's the kind of thing that The Economist loves writing about, how wonderful all that is. But what doesn't happen is roads don't get built, the big projects don't happen, and in those, again, as my answer before was, infrastructure is a bit different. I think there is a need for a lot more planning in that.
Regarding the role of the woman in Somaliland, as we've noticed, Michael and Epal, Somaliland women have played a significant role in the building of the country. They have played a significant role in development in terms of education, health, and also the part in developing the economic side of the country. They have played an important role in stabilizing the country, the region, and yet they are the invisible community or the group or the leaders. And my question is how best we can encourage Somaliland and also Somalia and other countries in the region the development of women within that arena of the role?
Our endeavours to support Somalilanders have included a long period now of work alongside, for example, NAGAD, the umbrella association of Somaliland women's organisations, and we're not an organisation going in and doing, we're an organisation who's supporting local organisations, civil society organisations to strengthen themselves. So I'd just like to make an observation about there is a mixed bag of international development actors, including those who are entirely Somalilander staffed in country and are supporting through supporting the efforts and direction of local organisations, so that, for example, Somalilander women have managed to have way more candidates at the local elections compared with 10 years ago. And sometimes some support that comes through, for example, other East African development workers who've got experience of similar issues in other countries, who go in and listen and work alongside, can be an important accompaniment to Somalilanders' indigenous efforts to make advances, whether it's on issues of women's rights or HIV and AIDS services, etc. But I'm also interested to hear a little bit more about what next steps we can support Somalilander women to be more active participants in this very delicate and complicated political process that's one of the topics this evening.
You're right, exactly, that women play a huge role in just about every sector in Somali society except politics. So I think if that's what you mean by women being invisible, then yes, you're right. That's true, and I think that's quite a problem. I mean, it's easy enough to work out why. It's because people are still saying, well, we don't want to support a candidate for election where we're not sure which clan they're going to represent. Your father or your husband, and so that argument comes up over and over again. That argument more than any other. And that's a big factor in all the negotiations that happen before an election. And it's a real problem then for a woman that wants to come through and stand for a position. How you change that is much harder. I'm not sure. I suspect that the quotas that have been women's groups, NAGAD included, have been lobbying for some time, might be one way that helps, at least temporarily, to change the ground so that people become used to the fact that there are women more active in the political institutions. There are women active in them, but they're not active as candidates, as politicians. I suspect that quotas can be very difficult because they're a blunt tool to address quite a complex socio-political issue. The ideal is that quota is used for a temporary period, and then once the effect has been had, you kind of somehow phase the quota out and see the effects lasting. Whether that can happen or not is a different question. That's a very difficult political decision to take. But the reason I think it's a problem is because I think, in effect, these changes, this transition from one form of democracy to another, I think women have lost out on having power in that. It used to be that women were a part of the political process, even if they weren't the ones sitting under the tree or in the meeting room or whatever it was, because they would talk to their husbands, they would put pressure on them, they would say what they wanted to see happen. There was a dialogue. It seems as though some of that dialogue has broken down a little bit, so that women now vote in larger numbers than men, but somehow they vote within a very conservative framework where they're still voting for the same clan candidates. Those candidates then, once they win, they go off and they do what they do for 5 years or 10 years, or as long as it is till the next election. And you lose the connection that used to be there for people, men and women, but women particularly lose out because they don't even become candidates, where they could put pressure on people in between times. So that's why it's a problem. I think what has happened is we've seen a diminishment of the political influence of women, a marginalization of women politically. It's important that there's a way of trying to address that, but it's not so easy to see what that way is. And I'm not Mike, I certainly am not saying that all development agencies are the same. I mean, I work in development as well, so I'm criticising an industry that I'm very conscious I'm a part of. In the comments I was making before, I've done a lot of work with Progressio. I have a great deal of respect for the work you're doing. In particular, the work on with women's groups, with development workers in Nagard and so on, and maybe even ESRC will give us some money so we can do some research together on women's political participation. We're waiting for their response this month, so you never know.
I'm a secondary school teacher and a director of a small organisation in London. I've lived here 25 years. I'd say, having gone back and forth to Somaliland, obviously looking back at and taking teachers back there to help with Abasa Tech School, we're training the teachers over there. We'll take a couple of my colleagues over there. I found one major obstacle with some of the, having been gone back as a diaspora. The locals always find you, you find a lot of, they're frustrated with you and you're frustrated with them. And one of the things I did find as a shock is the tribal element, which when you're over here and you're 9 to 5 in the UK, you find not as an obstacle to getting day to day. And I think a lot of the development agencies and a lot of organisations that do go over there, I had to find the most proactive individual to obviously facilitate my day-to-day schedule in Somaliland. So I find that a lot of people, when they do go back there, whether Michael is obviously monitoring the elections, so this is a question to Michael specifically, how big is the tribal element going to be this year, or the next election that's going to be approaching and obviously quite close, and how difficult do big NGOs or policymakers that are obviously trying to make things happen in the long run and create a vision of policies that are going to take place in that especially very important place called Somaliland in the long run. Because for me, I'm just a small piece that just tried to execute a few projects there, and I found it phenomenal. And then you've got arrogant individuals that you mentioned earlier that said, what's the tribal code got to play? And it plays seriously. And I'm coming from here in London 25 years later, I'm going there. Every time I go back there, it's serious. It affects your daily routine, it affects your daily business. You can't eat or breathe without it. You can't even order bottled water without obviously without associating with a particular clan with a bottle of water. That's how serious it is for those individuals that are in this room that don't seem to understand how vital the game is and how it's a sensitive nerve. And I feel sorry for those that are in politics and are going to be running the elections and those that are competing. I don't want to be a politician, seriously. Maybe in the UK, we're not there. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Michael.
Yeah, I sympathise. I'm fascinated with politics. I study it, but there's no way I want to be a politician. So I can understand that sentiment. Actually, there's no way I want to be a politician, precisely because politics is tough. It's really hard. Because you are attacked from all sides. You will be. That's the job. And it's true in Somaliland as it's true here. But in terms of the role clan will play, I think clan is still so important and has become even more important over the years through the Siadbare era that consolidated clan relationships. And then since 1991, those clan identity affiliations have become stronger and stronger and stronger as a social safety net, as a system of organization, social organization. So yeah, I know what you're describing. I mean, I'm lucky because not being a Somali, I don't have those restrictions, but I'm very aware of those restrictions from the many people that I know. Consequently, my answer to the question about what role clan will play in the elections is quite a lot, a great deal. It will play a role in the lead up to the elections, and it will play a role in the voting process, and it will play a role afterwards in the negotiations that go on once the results are in. There are some technical solutions that don't change the problem, but they help a little bit. So in 2012, in my mind, one of the big mistakes, and I understand why it happened, but it was a mistake in the end, was the decision to go with an open list, where every candidate was standing for themselves. because what it did was it created an environment where every candidate went first to their clan and second to their party. And they changed party if the clan wanted them to. What was important was the clan affiliation. And then they mobilized resources to campaign from their clan, not their party. And then they organized voters on the basis of clan, not party. Now, if that list had been closed, you would have had a restriction to that process, where the parties would have had to lead the process of organizing, campaigning, and so on. So, in my mind, there's a simple technical electoral process there, which, had the closed list been adopted, would have helped avoid the very polarized clan environment that drove the multiple voting that we saw in 2012 on a really wide scale. So there are little technical things like that. They don't solve the problem, but they help a little bit. So I think it's worth looking at those kinds of deals. I have to say, I understand exactly why the open list was adopted. There was a lot of discussion, and people felt that knowing the person you were voting for was more democratic. And that makes sense. I can understand that. But the effect of it was this, what I think was this polarization.
I have two quick questions. One is the issue of the East. And I don't know whether it is better, whether the issue of the East is very much different with the issue of Ogaden, for example, that people have double loyalty. Somali Ethiopia being busy with Jubaland, for example, or Kenyan Somalis being part of the Jubaland political process, or Isa community in Ethiopia being part of Djibouti process. So is that fair to single out Somaliland eastern provinces as a problem? And should we not look the borders differently as something loose and people just go on that side, and the party, and it's part of Somali politics. So that's one. And another one is, you mentioned that every time we have to be in that real treble zone before we kind of become reasonable to talk. And you talked about the Somali man who are part of the political process but who are losing out. They get involved in resolve the political issues. Are we also not abusing that, and they are credible because they are not politically engaged on a daily basis? Are we also not losing that in long term because they are involved in political process? That the problems maybe we will not be able to solve after a while. I don't know whether you got my question.
The first thing I want to say is that Michael's works in general have been a breath of fresh air for me in the research that I've been doing. But I'm also interested in Somaliland's becoming recognized. And I'm just wondering, would it not be somewhat in China's interest to support? No? Well, I don't know the most recent news, so I realize that there might be something very bad happening, but I just wondered if it could be at some point in their best interest to support Somaliland's efforts.
There's lots of discussion about different avenues for recognition, whether you could go to, Somaliland could go to Taiwan, or go to Israel, or all of these things have been discussed. Nothing is off the table, and actually it's probably true that it might just about be possible to get someone who is in a position where they really want international they want to make an international statement by doing so, to recognize Somaliland. But it could be that creates problems in its own right. I don't know. But anyway, the answer to China is Taiwan. China is terrified that the international community might start recognizing countries like Taiwan, and then they lose that one China position. And Taiwan's not keen on it either, because of course they still quite like the idea that they somehow got some legitimacy in the mainland. The issue of the East, no, I'm not sure that it is much different from the Ogaden in principle. It's the reason that I singled it out as a problem is because it's been made a problem by the political maneuvering between Puntland, Somaliland, and Khartoum in particular. And it would be great if people could accept that the borders were porous and that, you know, we don't need to resolve all the issues about exactly, you know, who administers this community and who administers that one. And it works, I think, much better in Sanag than it does in Seoul. So in the Wasangeli areas, you know, yeah, you can have two governors one from Puntland, one from Somaliland, sitting in the same meeting at the same time and have a meeting with them and talk about issues relating to that place. In Seoul, the divisions are much clearer and the positions people are taking are much clearer. I said when I was talking, it's not the only reason, but I think that oil is a bit of the reason for that. There's a perception that if oil is found in the Nugal Valley, they need to be in early. Everyone needs to be in early, making their claim, because then when it comes down to the point of deciding whose oil that is, they're going to be able to stand their ground and make an argument for a share of it or all of it or whatever. So I worry that that is the thing that makes me worried that area of Seoul and around Bohardli could be a flashpoint for conflict. I wish that it could be as you described, and there's no reason in principle why it couldn't be. But I think that there are geopolitical issues that mean that is less likely. In terms of that thing of reaching crisis before becoming reasonable, I didn't mean you were not reasonable before you got to the crisis. I liked Iqbal's expression of bungee jumping. That's pretty accurate. It does seem to me, and I think actually sometimes, like bungee jumping, actually people do it for the experience. There's an adrenaline rush, and you know, taking that leap over the cliff and then coming back. But I don't know. I mean, I have more faith in human societies in general, that people do find ways of working out problems in the end, and they tend to get better at it. So I don't see that Somaliland is going to become, with this transition, it is an important transition. There are really fundamental changes going to happen sociopolitically and happening now, and they will change the way decisions are made, and they will change the way crises are dealt with. But I'm not pessimistic that Somaliland's not capable, Somalis are not capable of adjusting, of adapting, so that they're still just as good at dealing with the problems when they come up. It's an iterative process, but it's happening, and it's been happening over a long period now. So I don't think you'll lose that ability. I think that ability is still there, and is going to keep being there.
And the final word from Ali Awale, who is Somaliland's ambassador to the UK.
Somaliland lies in a very good location, which is the Gulf of Aden, the Red Sea, and that's very important to international maritime and transportation. Of course, Somaliland has got that agreements with the international community to support in the fight against piracy and terrorism. We have actually housed some of the pirates that have been caught, and where no one else wanted to have them. On another side, Somaliland has been waiting for 23 years for a recognition, to build itself, to become a nation, to become part of the world. We have been doing our best to make peace. We have been doing our best to please our friends, Ethiopia, Djibouti, and to some extent the Somalis who were fighting within themselves. But if you go to Hargeisa and Burhan, the big cities of Somaliland, you'll find maybe 1/3 of the population is from Somalia. So the schools and universities in Somaliland are producing knowledgeable young people, and Somaliland is a young nation. The population is about 70% below 30 years of age. Don't you think, if the world does not change this attitude of non-recognition, because this is affecting the investment, this is affecting the banking system, affecting the trade with the world, and affecting employment. We have an unemployment of almost 80%. And every year we have got new graduates from universities. And there are the other challenges on the other side, which is Al-Shabaab here, trying to do as best as they can to recruit young people. People who are trying to, because of lack of employment and investment in the country, want to go abroad, trying to escape and do all this through the desert of Libya and the seas, and many of them have died there. Don't you see the prospect of Somaliland governments unable to maintain the peace and stability as they do today is on the cards if the world does not change this attitude of no recognition? Talk to Somalia, where there is nobody to talk to, where there's no serious government to engage. Did you see it from that angle? It's just a comment.
Yeah, there's a risk. I mean, I think if Somaliland is to get recognition, then it will be because they play a very clever political game. The easiest thing to see would be something like, and there was no appetite for this discussion before, but something like happened in South Sudan, that were Somaliland to go to the international community with an offer to say, okay, we'll hold a referendum, another referendum, and there was no, everyone would say, we don't need another referendum, we've already had one. And it's true, you did, but still the recognition is not there. Now, if there was something like that which said, okay, we'll hold another one, and the results will be binding. Now, the only way that Mogadishu is going to accept that is if they think they might win. If they think they're going to lose, they'll say no to start with. So you've got to find a way of framing it that they think it's going to happen. Sudan, they agreed. And it was because of that agreement, because of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement and the agreement that after 6 years there would be a referendum, and that referendum would be binding. That was what led to the independence and recognition of South Sudan. But without some mechanism like that, it's really hard to see how the Somaliland case is going to end up resulting in full recognition. That's why I'm saying I don't see that on the immediate horizon. Prove me wrong. Whatever it is, there's got to be some really creative bit of diplomacy or politics that changes the game. And what is it? I can't see it on the table at the moment. I do think it's important Somaliland keeps talking to Somalia. Those talks, even if they were going nowhere, were good for Somaliland because it shows that Somaliland is willing to go to the table. Even better if there was some way of using them creatively.